Hey, this is Danny Naylor. Back again. This is our third video on this topic. We did a summary of the NAR settlement and the practice changes, and then we did kind of an overview of the UAR forms changes that they've done to help make us help us to serve our clients better with these new changes. And now I just wanted to go over some of the common questions we've seen on social media from agents in the trainings that I've been a part of. And see if we can help address those so that people know what to do. And we'll start out with some of the things that are kind of immediate, like what do I need to do today? Today I'm recording on August 15th, and so what changes need to happen today? So first question is, if I have a listing that was signed before August 14th, then what should I do? Well, if it's not under contract, then in order to make it compliant with the new settlement processes, the new ways that we do things, you'll need to have an addendum done to your listing agreement that adds the new language that takes the compensation off of the multiple listing service and deals with that. So any listings that you had currently before August 14th that have not gone under contract yet, you need to sign a new addendum for that. You can find that in the UAR forms library. Okay. What about if you had a buyer broker agreement signed before August 14th? Same thing. If you have a buyer broker agreement before August 14th and you're not under contract yet, then you need to get an addendum signed to make it compliant, because the old compensation stuff referred to the multiple listing service and the BAC on there, and that's not going to be on there anymore. So you need to get an addendum that clarifies that. So get that addendum signed right away. What if you want to start a new listing right now? Then what form should you use? Well, you should use the new version of the UAR exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Okay, it'll have all that new language in it already. Now, of course, you can get your own listing agreement. If you had one from your brokerage already, you can have an attorney create one for your brokerage and do your own. But if you are using the Utah Association of Realtor forms, then just use the latest exclusive right to sell listing agreement. It has all that new language incorporated right into it. Okay. If you have a new buyer you want to represent, same idea. Use the new UAR buyer brokerage and agency agreement that they have. It incorporates all that new language. Okay. If you have a home under contract before August 14th, but it hasn't closed yet, then what should you do? Well, in that case, you shouldn't have to make any changes to the forms that you have with your listing agreement or with your buyer broker agreement, because when it went under contract, that's locked in the terms that were previously in effect. So if there was a BAC offered on the MLS at the time that you went under contract, that would still be in effect now, because the moment it went under contract, those terms were kind of locked into place. So you don't need to update your contracts for that, but you do hopefully have a record of what BAC was offered on the multiple listing service, because that has now been removed. That's not shown on there anymore. So in order to be compliant with the new terms. So, okay, what else we got? If I represent the buyer and the seller's offer of compensation is less than the compensation agreed with the buyer, where can I get the difference? Okay, so I represent the buyer, my compensation, let's say that I asked for 4% from my buyer and the seller is only offering 2%. So where can I get the difference? Well, you can either have your buyer pay it directly, they can always pay cash or come up with their money on their own, or you can, through the offer that you put to the property, you can add an addendum that's a brokerage payment addendum, so that the buyer is asking the seller to agree to pay the difference in the commission that the buyer owes to their broker. So if you have 4% in your buyer broker agreement and the offer of compensation is only 2%, then in the real estate purchase contract you would ask for an additional 2%. And the UAR has a addendum there that is designed for this purpose, and it says that any compensation asked for from the seller would be in addition to any brokerage compensation sharing between the brokerages. So if you are short 2% from the offer of compensation from the other broker, then you would put an additional 2% in the offer to the seller, potentially in the REPC, the offer that you send over. Okay. If I represent the buyer and the seller's offer of compensation is more than my compensation agreed with the buyer, how do I get the difference? Now this one's a little tricky, because with the new settlement agreement, you're not allowed to get any additional compensation over and above what your buyer broker agreement has in there. Now, this shouldn't be a change for most agents, because as a fiduciary for your buyer client, you're supposed to be loyal to them and put their interests before your own. And so if you had agreed to a certain amount of commission, say 4%, and now the seller is offering 6% to the buyer side, then you wouldn't what's that offer? What's the value of that to you, right? Obviously, it would benefit you personally as an agent to get that additional compensation, but who would be paying for it? Okay, if it's an additional term of the purchase of the property, then it's either the buyer or the seller paying for it, or both. And so as a loyal agent to your buyer, you probably would not ask for that additional compensation unless you got permission from your buyer. And since you already have a buyer-broker agreement where you've already agreed to what your value is and what you're going to be compensated for the transaction, it seems like kind of a conflict of interest to say to your buyer, now that they're offering more, I would like you to pay more to pay me more, even though we already had an agreement. So based on your loyalty to your buyer broker, this new settlement kind of clarifies that you shouldn't be allowed, that you're not allowed to take additional compensation above that which is in your buyer broker agreement. Okay, now can you add an addendum to that buyer broker agreement to increase that amount if there's an offer of compensation for more? I believe legally you probably can increase that, but I think your fiduciary of loyalty to your buyer means you would have to explain to them where that money's coming from and who's paying for that, and that would be a discussion you'd have to have with your buyer and see what they want to do. But in all of this, the primary concern is that you want to do what's best for your client. You want to get clear communication, clear understanding of what compensation is being paid, so that everybody's on the same page. That's the point of all of this. Okay? Okay, so if I can't advertise my offer of compensation on the buyer's agent commission on the multiple listing service, then where can I advertise it? Well, you can advertise it on any of your own private advertisements. If you post on social media, you could put it there. If you put it on your own website, you could put it there. You know, you can put your offer of commission anywhere where you advertise personally, but what you can't do is put it on the multiple listing service or anything associated with the multiple listing service. So like aligned showings is attached in there, you couldn't do that. I don't really think it would be a good idea to try and set up another website where all the offers of compensation are shown, because that would sort of become a new multiple listing service because it's listing properties for sale. And so you can do it on your own private stuff, but you can't do it on any of the combined repositories or places where all the listings come together. Okay. Now you can link from your private social media posts where you list your offer of compensation. You can link from there to the multiple listing service to show your listing over there. But what you can't do is on the multiple listing service put in a link that goes straight to your ad that shows the BAC, because then it would be essentially part of the multiple listing service. Okay, so you can link to the multiple listing service, but you can't link back from the multiple listing service to your ad that lists a BAC. Since I don't know the BAC offered on every listing, can I set my buyer broker agreement to be a commission up to a certain percentage? No, you can't do that. The buyer broker agreement needs to have a very clear commission amount that's clearly understood. And if it's up to, then we don't know where that's going to land. That's not very clear. So it needs to be either a straight number or it needs to be a straight percentage that's easy to calculate from the purchase price, like is common practice. It needs to be very clear like that. It can't be an up to amount. What if an unrepresented buyer asks the seller agent to provide comparables to justify the price? Well, if the seller's agent, who do they represent? They represent the seller, right? So they should only be providing information that is allowed by the seller to share with them. So if they want to see comparables that justify the price you have listed, you can do that. You can show these homes have a similar price to the one that the seller has agreed to list the property at. You can do that. Just be careful that you're not sharing information that would compromise your seller's position if you represent the seller. Can a listing agent fill out the state-approved REPC or UAR forms for the unrepresented buyer? Now this is tricky because if anything that the listing agent does as far as like real estate advice or legal advice for an unrepresented buyer could be a violation of their fiduciary duty of loyalty to their seller. So you want to be real careful as a listing agent that you don't do things that could help somebody who you don't represent, specifically that might be in conflict of what your client would like. And so what you can do is you can direct them to where they can find these forms. If an unrepresented buyer says, how do I submit an offer? You can show them on the state website where to find the real estate purchase contract, but I'd be really careful about helping them fill it out, because any advice you give, any explanation you give about the terminology there, any way that you direct them on how to fill that out could do one of two things. It could either be a violation of your loyalty to your seller, or it could make that unrepresented buyer believe that you are also representing them, and that would create like an implied agency situation where they think you're working in their best interest, but you're not. We need to make it very clear who we represent in the transaction and whose interests that we're looking out for. So as the seller's agent, not only do you want to make sure that the unrepresented buyer hears the words, I represent the seller's interest, you also need to make sure your actions don't imply otherwise. And filling out a REPC or other forms for the unrepresented buyer, or helping them to fill those out, is a strong way to imply that you're looking out for their interests. So be very cautious about that. Does a listing agent need a showing agreement to show their own listing? No, they do not. So there's a new rule that in order to show a property to a potential buyer, you have to get an agreement with that buyer before you can show the property. But a listing agent already has an agreement with the seller to market that property, so they can totally show that property to buyers. They don't need an additional agreement to show property to buyers, okay? Because they already have an agreement that says, I represent the seller, and that's a clear agreement that then they disclose to the buyer, and then they can show that property. That's no problem at all. If a showing agreement is signed before a showing a buyer a property, what fiduciary duties does the agent have to the buyer? Now that's going to depend on the showing agreement that you sign, right? So a showing agreement can be 0 fiduciary duties up to full fiduciary duties, okay? But at a minimum, you always owe to anybody honesty and disclosure of material facts, okay? You have reasonable care and diligence. You need to take care of people. So those things you'll owe regardless of what your agreement says. But if your showing agreement also includes agency, then you would include all of the fiduciary duties. But if it doesn't include full agency, you still have to be honest and show care and disclose any material facts that you know. What obligation does a listing agent have to unrepresented buyers? That's what we just talked about. You have to be honest. You have to disclose any material facts you know. But you don't necessarily have to. You still have a duty of confidentiality to your seller. You still have loyalty to your seller. But the unrepresented buyer, as a customer on the other side of the transaction, still deserves honesty, reasonable care, and that you treat them fairly and honestly. That's the core there. What can a listing agent do for an unrepresented buyer who discovers due diligence items during an inspection? So an unrepresented buyer has an inspection done. They discover potentially a problem, a physical problem with the property. What can the listing agent do for them? The answer is not much, because any advice you give them could be a breach of your fiduciary duties to your seller. So what you ought to do is advise them to get representation if they need it. Unrepresented buyers need to be treated fairly, and the listing agent, since they represent the seller, they can't really give them advice, and so they should advise them to get representation if that's what they need to sort out those items. So which scenario serves the seller better, a seller's agent and an unrepresented buyer, or one agent represents both the seller and the buyer as a limited agent? Now, one of the core fiduciary duties, the things that we can offer to our clients, is this duty of loyalty to their interests. If someone becomes a limited agent, then they no longer have loyalty to either the buyer or the seller. So when you ask the question, which scenario serves the seller better, I believe that full fiduciary duties of confidentiality, loyalty, disclosure, all of those things are the best way to serve any client, really. So full agency, full fiduciary duties to one client is going to serve them better than any kind of limited agency will. So that's something to always to consider, that loyalty is a very important part of being an agent and providing the best service possible. Have agents been paid to show property over the last 20 years? Now, it's sort of a complicated question because agents will show properties without agreements over the last 20 years, at least in Utah and maybe all over the whole country. Agents have been showing lots of properties without any agreement, and so a lot of people that they show properties to, they never get paid for, but they do that sort of as a marketing thing to sort of build trust and so to try to earn somebody's business. And so have they been paid to show property? Well, yes, but in a marketing sense. But the question remains, should agents be paid to show property now that we're required to have an agency agreement to show, excuse me, we're not required to have an agency agreement. We are required to have an agreement before we show property now. So the question comes, should I include any sort of compensation in that? And that's really up to you. You can do it for free if you want, but I don't know very many businesses that survive by giving away services for free all the time. As a marketing effort, that can work sometimes, as we've done a lot over the past years, but I would consider that as we move forward as to what you're willing to do for free. So who enforces the new NAR practice changes? The Department of Justice is the one that's going to be enforcing those changes, and they will be investigating, and they will be probably doing tests on agents and checking on transactions to see how we're doing on our compliance. But as agents, what we really need to do is hold ourselves responsible. We need to be doing the best service for our clients and doing what's in their best interest. And if we do that, if we're loyal to our clients, if we have clear communication about compensation, if the agreements are very clear about who's getting paid and where, and our clients know everywhere that we're getting paid, that'll solve pretty much all the problems that the settlement's all about. If we treat our clients right, then this settlement won't really change much in the way that we practice business. Why would a buyer want to be unrepresented? Okay. Now, number one is, I think, just that spirit of I want to be able to do something myself, right? That's probably the number one. But number two is probably to save money. They believe that there's a lot of money out there and they want to save where they can. And honestly, with a lot of the technology advances that we've had over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of things that buyers can do on their own now, right? They can search properties on their own. They can compare properties on their own. They can even investigate things about common home problems, common things found in inspections, right? There's so much information available out there right now. So what value does a realtor provide? That's what you'll have to prove, okay? There's still a lot of value in the expertise that realtors have in the market, in the transaction, how to negotiate for repairs or for prices or for contingencies. So there is value that realtors offer, but I think we need to recognize also that technology and has given buyers a lot more ability to investigate things on their own and to facilitate a transaction, okay? So we need to recognize those changes, and that if we're going to still provide value, we need to make sure that we're still providing something that the buyer can't do on their own, okay? Can a seller pay a buyer's brokerage commission? Why, yes, they can. And there's a new UER form to accomplish that, an addendum to the real estate purchase contract. Now, they are working on potentially incorporating some of that language into the real estate purchase contract, adding a new paragraph where the buyer can ask the seller to pay some of their buyer brokerage commission. But while we're waiting on that language to get approved, we do have an addendum from the Utah Association of Realtors that you can use, where the buyer asks the seller directly in the offer, in the REPC, in the real estate purchase contract, to pay a portion of their buyer agent commission to their broker. And the language in that addendum says that it's in addition to any sharing of brokerage compensation between the two brokerages, okay? So you can still do both. You can still share compensation between brokerages, and then you can also ask the seller to pay additionally to the buyer broker if the commission sharing agreement didn't cover everything that the buyer had agreed to pay to their broker. Okay, how about if an agent goes on vacation, what does the agent have to do to take care of their clients? Well, primarily it's clear expectations. The client should understand what availability the agent has and how they'll be able to help while they're gone. Now, it may be that that's all they need is clear communication about when they'll be gone, where they'll be, not necessarily where they'll be, but what they'll be able to do for the client while they're gone, which potentially could be nothing. If the client knows that and understands that, that might be enough. But if they're in the middle of a transaction, if they're under contract, if the client has something that's time sensitive that needs to be done, then the agent should have a backup agent put in place to cover those situations for them. Now, if a broker has in their agency agreement already set up that they can assign another agent to help out, then that's helpful. But if they're not, you should look at your agency agreement and make sure that if you do set up another agent to cover for you, that they are covered, that they are signed up as a fiduciary for your client, and that there's clear understanding about who's going to do what while you're gone. Can a seller's agent ask to see a buyer-broker agreement to verify the commission? Absolutely, they can ask, but they don't. But there's no obligation for the buyer-broker, buyer-agent to share that information with the seller. Okay, so the agreement between the buyer and the buyer-broker, that's their private agreement, and they don't have to share that with the seller side. Okay, I would probably want to be open about how much commission is agreed to in there, just for the point of working the transaction through to completion, but you don't have to share the whole agreement with the seller. Okay, they're welcome to ask. If the buyer and the buyer broker are willing to share that, that could be good for the transaction. You know, it'll be transaction specific, but the buyer and the buyer broker do not need to share that agreement. That's their information that they can decide what to do with. Can a buyer agent ask to see a listing agreement to verify the offer of compensation? Yeah, I mean, they can. The buyer can ask, the buyer agent can ask to see that, and the listing agent and the seller have that, that's their private information that they can choose whether to share or not. Now, we used to have buyer agent commission listed right publicly on the MLS, so I don't know why you wouldn't want to share that going forward, but I can see some situations where in negotiation you would want to negotiate that out before you showed the whole amount. For example, in the seller commission agreement right now, it says that the offer of compensation is up to how much the seller agent can offer to the buyer. So I can see using that as a negotiation tactic to try and save the seller money. So, but just make sure we treat other agents respectfully and that we negotiate in good faith. All right. Should the title company request a copy of the listing agreement or the buyer-broker agreement? Well, if they want to be compliant with all the contracts that are going around, it would be real easy for them to do that if they had copies of all those agreements. So I can see it being a totally fair thing for the title company to request a copy of the listing agreement to see the commission amounts, or the buyer-broker agreement to see the same. Do they have to request that, or do the listing company or the buyer-broker have to send those? No, they don't. That's not a requirement. But the idea being just that you want to make sure that everybody understands what the terms are of the contract, so the transaction can be handled smoothly. Okay, so should they request it? They want to get the information. That's the most important. They don't necessarily need to see. They don't necessarily need to see the whole agreement, but they do need to have the information to handle the transaction properly. Does the settlement make any change to the clear cooperation policy? Now, clear cooperation is an agreement that members of the Association of Realtors will, as soon as they advertise a property for sale, they will, within a reasonable amount of time, list that property on the multiple listings service. Now, this is because we believe that it's in the seller's best interest to have their property exposed to the widest possible group of potential buyers. Okay, the more potential buyers see it, the more likely we are to find buyers who are potentially interested and potentially can afford it. And so casting the widest possible net is in the best interest of our sellers. And that's the purpose of the clear cooperation policy. This NAR settlement has no effect on clear cooperation. We might start to see sellers start to advertise their listings in additional ways in addition to the MLS, because they want to be able to share the BAC that they offer, the offer of commission to a buyer's agent that brings a buyer. But having them advertise in additional places doesn't negate the benefit of listing it on the multiple listing service. And so clear cooperation is still in effect. We still want sellers to get the best possible outcome for their listings. Can a seller's agent ask to see a buyer-broker agreement to verify commission? Oh, I guess we already went over that. Okay, so we'll call that a wrap. Okay, so it's a great change. All these NAR settlement things, a lot of these are going to push us in a good direction. So hopefully all of us can treat our clients well, and we can work well together to get the best outcome for our clients, and after that for ourselves. And let's make a special effort to lift up ourselves in this industry, to lift each other up, right? Let's treat each other with dignity, let's negotiate in good faith, and let's help each other to comply with these new terms and to do the best for all of our clients, okay? All right, we'll see you next time.